I'm going to show you a prayer which totally destroys a popular Hebrew Israelite belief, and I'll show you how to use this prayer in today's video. Now, this isn't a belief held by all of the Hebrew Israelite camps, but it seems like the popular groups, at least, that you find online and you may see on the street corners, are the ones espousing the doctrine that Israel are the only people that can be saved. Now, the prayer I want to talk about comes from the Old Testament. It comes from King Solomon, from this passage right here in 1 Kings chapter 8. King Solomon here is dedicating the temple. And as you can see in verse 22, this is basically where it begins to pick off in regards to the prayer. It says, "And Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the congregation of Israel. And he spread forth his hands toward heaven." So Solomon here is praying, his hands are lifted up to heaven. And as we saw in this verse, it talks about how all of the tribes of the Israelites were present in this particular encounter. So it's not like this was only Judah and Benjamin or Levi. This was the full 12 tribes, and that will be very beneficial as we continue into today's video. Now, as we scroll down, for example, we can look at verse 28 to 29, and we can begin to see some of the things that Solomon says in this prayer and how it begins to destroy this false doctrine that only Israelites can be saved. "Yet have you respect unto the prayer of your servant," right? Speaking about himself, "and to his supplication, O Lord my God, to hearken unto the cry and to the prayer which your servant prays before you today." So firstly, just simply Solomon is petitioning the Lord, listen to my prayer, hear my prayer, answer my prayer, etc. And in 29 it says, "that your eyes may be open toward this house night and day," so round the clock, "toward the place of which you have said, my name shall be there, that you may hearken unto the prayer which your servant shall make toward this place." Notice Solomon here in these two verses, I'm highlighting this to show you that you're establishing that the whole of the nation of Israel is here represented. He's petitioning Solomon, that is the Lord, to answer his prayer. Now when we scroll down to get into some of the juice of the prayer, we're going to look at verse 33 and work our way down to a couple of verses. He spends about 7 verses here speaking about when Israel falls into sin or when Israel is in trouble, what should the Lord do? Listen to what he says. He says, "When thy people Israel be smitten down before the enemy, because they have sinned against you, and they shall turn again to you, and they shall confess your name, and pray and make supplication unto you into this house." What does Solomon say God should do for the nation of Israel? "Then hear you in heaven, forgive the sin of your people Israel, and bring them again unto the land which you gave unto their fathers." This again is establishing the key fact that this is all of the nation of Israel, right? Because the Lord gave land to the whole nation, not just specific tribes. And Solomon here is exclaiming and saying, "Lord, please, when they sin and they call on you again out of trouble, hear their prayer, listen to them, and honor them," basically. He continues, "When heaven is shut up and there is no rain, because they have sinned against you, if they pray toward this place, and they confess your name and turn from their sin when thou hast afflicted them, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of thy servants." Notice the constant theme here, similar to the cycle we see in the book of Judges, right? If they sin and are falling into judgment, then they repent, and then the Lord delivers them. This is what Solomon is praying to the Lord. He continues, let's scroll down. "If there's pestilence and blasting and mildew and locust or the caterpillar, or if the enemy besiege them in the land, or if there's a plague or sickness, what prayer and supplication soever be unto you by all your people Israel," again, all of the nation of Israel is who he's describing here, "which shall know every man the plague of his own heart, and spread forth his hands towards this house." So when your people are in the famine, and they understand the plagues from their own hearts, and they're seeking you, praying towards this house, Solomon says, "Hear in heaven, which is your dwelling place, and forgive, and do and give to every man according to his ways, whose heart you know. And he says, for you are the only one that knows the hearts of all the children of men. And he says that they may fear you all the days that they live. And he highlights this again, that this is speaking to people in who the land was given to the fathers. The whole nation of Israel is basically the point Solomon is reiterating again. Now, bear in mind, we started in verse 22 with Solomon's prayer. And we've gone about 20 verses down now through the narrative as Solomon is basically speaking to God on behalf of the nation of Israel. Now, this is where we segue now to moving away from the Israelites to the non-Israelites. And notice what Solomon says and how this clearly starts to take down and destroy the false doctrine by some of these Hebrew Israelite groups who are ultimately cults and don't want to offer or believe salvation is offered to the whole of mankind through faith. As we scroll down now, we look at verse 41 to 43. He continues. Solomon now says, moreover, right? So on top of what I've said, Lord, concerning a stranger, a non-Israelite, that not of thy people Israel, right? He's making it so clear. This is a stranger who is not of the nation of Israel. And we'll deal with an objection that some of these groups will try and bring up later on in today's video, don't worry. But they come out of a far country. Why? For your name's sake. Think about somebody like Rahab, who at this point in the scriptures we've already read about, or Ruth, the Moabitess, who we've read about in the book of Ruth. Two examples of Gentiles, non-Israelites, who came out of different countries, different places, and entered into the nation of Israel. He continues, for they shall hear of thy great name and of thy strong hand, just like Rahab did in Joshua chapter 2, and of thy stretched out arm when he shall come and pray toward this house. So Solomon is saying here that the stranger who is not of Israel, who hears of the Lord's mighty power, will decide to come and pray toward this house, right? And that's going to be vital towards the end of today's video as well. He says, hear you in heaven, which is your dwelling place, and do according to all, how much? All, Solomon says, that the stranger calls to thee, for that all people of the earth may know thy name, to fear you, as thy people Israel obviously fears him, and that they may know that this house which Solomon has obviously builded is called by thy name. Think about what Solomon's actually saying here in these sets of verses. A stranger who's not of the people of Israel, who comes from a far country for the name of the Lord's sake, right? They've heard about the Lord's great name and the Lord's great power. Those individuals, Solomon says, can pray towards this house. They can pray toward God. And what does Solomon say about these strangers? That their prayers will not be heard and they have no opportunity to pray and have God answer their prayers. Here in heaven, Solomon says, the stranger, and do everything that the stranger is calling to you for. Why does Solomon say he wants God to answer these non-Israelites' prayers? So that all people of the earth may know your name, so they can fear you as the Israelites fear you. Notice this. The whole of the nation, all of the tribes fear God. And Solomon wants the strangers from different places who come to know God and to trust in him to fear God as well. Let's look at three objections, right? And we can walk through them one by one. So the first objection is going to be that this was just a prayer, right? This doesn't mean anything. This was just Solomon making a request, making a prayer. I'll deal with that before we wrap up today's video. The second may be something along the lines of, oh, this was when the tribes were united before the tribes were divided and spread abroad, etc. But if Solomon is praying about a future time when the Israelites will fall into sin, how is it that he is foreseeing that, but he's not necessarily able to foresee that tribes will be divided. It's not really a strong case. But the most popular argument you're probably going to hear is that this word right here, stranger, is not speaking about a non-Israelite stranger. It's speaking about an Israelite who's been spread abroad into a different location and doesn't know they're an Israelite. The wide usage of this word for stranger here, right, which is nokri, is all about a non-Israelite. There may be like one example out of 45. The wide usage of this word in the Old Testament in Hebrew is all speaking about a non-Israelite, a true Gentile. So in order for a Hebrew Israelite to really hold to that belief and say, you know what, no, this is one of those exceptions, one of those extremely rare exceptions, there has to be something compelling in the text which should suggest this. But the problem with that is, apart from it being extremely widely used across the Old Testament for non-Israelites, true Gentiles, the whole context of this passage, as we've kind of unpacked some of it in today's video, is all about the whole nation of Israel as one collection, one group, and the strangers who are not Israel, as Solomon so nicely caveats this statement about strangers. Now, remember I said that the first objection a Hebrew Israelite may make to a prayer by Solomon is that this is just Solomon making a prayer. This doesn't mean anything. He's just making some petition and requests. But the problem with that example is the fact that if you go to the next chapter once the prayer is finished, if you read verse 9, for example, of chapter 9, you can clearly see that the Lord heard his prayer. Even if you look at the cross-reference of this passage from the book of Chronicles, it's referenced as Solomon saying the stranger prays in the house. But more specifically, it talks about how the Lord answered by fire Solomon's prayer. So God ultimately accepted this prayer, the prayer for the Israelites as a whole, and for the stranger who would come to worship the Lord and pray towards the house. So hopefully this is a video which will help you engage with professing Hebrew Israelites who hold this particular false doctrine. I've got other videos dealing with these sorts of Hebrew Israelites as well on the channel. Watch it in your own time, or feel free to watch another video on the channel. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and see you on the next video. God bless. See you soon.